Happy Feature Friday, my quilting friends. It is so great to have you guys joining me here again in my sewing studio. We are at the tail end of my Alice in Wonderland fabric quilt, and I am about to stitch out my last row, but I don't have a lot of backing left. And I think if I stitch out the whole row as it is, I am going to be stitching clear onto my leaders. So I am going to be using my crop feature that I have on my robotic system that is available on the mid and top of the line systems to crop off the bottom of my design so that I don't stitch much off of my quilt top. I'm going to show you guys how to do that so that you can try this at home. This might save you a little bit of thread, a lot of stitching time, and hopefully keep you from quilting onto your leaders as well. I'm going to turn you guys around. So you can see here that I've got my row of stitching here. I've got, depending on where we're at, maybe 6 to 8 inches of my quilt left to do. And my design kind of covers a little bit more than that. So if I were to pull my crosshairs down to the very bottom of the design, my needle is all the way out here, and that's where my leaders kind of are, and I do not want to stitch on those. So we need to kind of crop off, I'm going to say about 3 inches of the design so that I don't stitch all this out and end up stitching out here on my leaders. So I'm going to show you guys how to do that. The first thing I'm going to want to do is turn on my jump stitches, because as we take off the bottom chunk of this design, it's going to be cutting all of these little circles in half, and it's going to need to start and stop and start and stop. And I'd rather have my jump stitches on so that it just continues on with the pattern and does its tie-offs on its own instead of making me start and stop constantly. So I am going to go into settings, which is our little gears here. And then up at the top, we go to parameters and highlight that. And then I'm going to come over to jump stitches. And right now I am set to 0. I'm going to highlight that. Gives me a keypad, and I think I'm going to set that to 6. 6 is 6 inches. So that's 6 inches in between each time it ties off and jumps to the next place where it needs to tie off. So I'm going to try that. I'm going to hit my check mark, and my jump stitches now read 6. I'm going to go back to layout this time. And as you can see, I have my fully nested row. If I were to stitch this out from here, it would stitch out fine. It would nest into my row before. It would just stitch all the way down here into my batting, and it might catch my leaders, and I don't want to do that. So what we're going to do is create a really skinny layout box down here at the bottom of our design, and then we're going to crop off those bottom bubbles. So let's do that now. I'm in layout. I'm going to add a layout box by hitting my plus sign on the right side of my display. And it says sit the first point of my pattern box. So the first point of my pattern box, I'm just going to come, if you can see the corner of my quilt here, I'm going to come just below the corner of my quilt to set the first point of my pattern box. I do want the stitching just to run below that in case this like pulls up a little bit as it stitches. So I'm going to come just below that, maybe about 1/2 inch. And I'm going to set that as the first point of my pattern box. So I'm going to hit my plus sign. Then I'm going to slide all the way down to the other side of my frame. And I'm going to come with, using my screen as a reference, I'm going to bring my crosshairs down to the bottom of my display. You see my green line there? That's my pattern box that's got my design in it, my safe area. I'm coming down to the bottom of that just so I know I'm catching everything. And I'm going to hit my check mark there. And you can see that I've got this big old skinny box. Now that is this whole bottom area That's my white batting that I want to crop the design out of because I do not want that to be stitched in. I want all of my stitching to stay on my quilt top. And you can see that this box that we've created is number 3 of 3. I'm going to hit my back arrow down here and go back to box 2 of 3, which is my design. Now I'm going to go to my edit feature and highlight that. And we are going to be working with this one, 2 of 3, knowing that 3 of 3 is our skinny little box hanging out there. Whoop, we went back to 1 of 3. There we are, 2 of 3. In our editing features, we want to come over to our crop feature. And our crop feature is this little box over here that's got a box on top of it that's kind of open with a line that runs through it. You guys see that there? We're going to highlight that. And now that we've got that, and we've got our little skinny box on the next page, we can go ahead and hit our crop button, and it's going to take that whole box off. I'm going to go ahead and hit my bottom button here off to the right, and it has now taken off all of the design work that is out here hanging off the bottom of my quilt. And you can see it's cut all of those little bubbles in half. So now if I move my crosshairs up and I get my blue line kind of hovering across the very bottom of where all those bubbles got cut off, if I look down at my quilt, I'm up here. So I've got about an inch between the bottom of my quilt and where my needle is. So I'm not going to stitch any lower than that. So I can feel I am nowhere near where my leaders are, which is down here, which I didn't want stitching into it. But if I hadn't cut off and cropped off that whole bottom area, I would have been stitching on my leaders. So that's exactly what I wanted. It's going to stitch out my design on my quilt top. It's going to come off just a little bit into my batting, which is fine with me. I've got my jump stitches on, so it's going to jump across the bottom of all those little circles. So let's go ahead and get this started. I'm going to hit my home button, my needle's engaged, and I'm going to hit my green start. My needle's not down in my fabric, so I'm going to hit my green check mark, and I'm going to let my machine do its thing. It's going to slide all the way over into place, and we're going to get started. And I'll bring you back in just a little bit. All right, everybody, we are finished stitching out that very last row on our quilt. As you can see, we got our row finished, and it stitched about 3/4 of an inch into our backing and batting off of our quilt. And I hope you can see here amongst all of my little fabric threads, you can see my jump stitches here. So I've got my jump stitches across the quilt from where my circles started and stopped. There's a little one under here, so you can see how that works. But overall, I think it did a great job, and it kept me from stitching onto my leaders. So that is the easiest way to kind of crop off that bottom section of your design if you are working with a quilt pattern and it just runs too long into your batting and backing off the bottom of your quilt. So I hope that is helpful. Sometimes you just can't plan for those things, and even if you do plan for those things, sometimes it just gets off a little bit and you end up having to do that anyway. So I hope that is helpful. This was another question that was brought up by one of our quilting friends on Facebook, and so I hope that is helpful for our quilting friend out there and for a lot of you, because I know this is a very common thing that we all go through. How do we save ourselves from having to stitch out that full last row? Thank you guys so much. I hope you join me again next week, and we'll see you real soon.